I was hiking in the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula back in 2003. I'd set out to do something I'd been planning for months, a long hike from the ocean all the way up toward Mount Olympus. It sounded ambitious, but I'd prepared for it. I had my gear, my food, and a solid plan. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The air was damp and rich, that deep green smell of wet moss and old trees filling every breath. The trail wound through massive spruce and hemlock, and the Hoh River ran alongside me most of the way, its sound steady and calming. Everything felt alive. The dripping leaves, the ferns brushing my legs, the distant sound of birds echoing through the forest. That night I camped near the river, cooked a small meal, and slept like a rock. It was exactly what I wanted out of the trip. Quiet, solitude, and the feeling of being completely away from the world. The second day was a completely different story. When I woke up, the air was thick. Fog had rolled in overnight, not just a light mist, but a solid wall of gray that hung low and heavy through the trees. I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. It was one of those times when sound changes too. Everything gets muffled, dampened, like the world is wrapped in cotton. I could hear the river faintly, but couldn't even see the other side of it. I packed up my camp and started following the river upstream, using it as my guide since my GPS was nearly useless. The signal kept flickering, and the compass readings seemed to twist in strange directions every time I tried to check them. The ground was soft, soaked through with rain from the night before, and every step squished a little. My boots were soon covered in mud and bits of moss, but I kept moving. The fog never lifted, stayed thick all day. Every now and then I'd stop and just listen, trying to make sure I was still following the right sound of the river. But all I heard was that slow, steady rush of water and the occasional drip from the trees. I didn't see another hiker, didn't hear a bird, not even the faint hum of insects. The forest felt empty. I tried not to think too hard about that. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The kind of tired where your pack feels twice as heavy and every small hill feels like a mountain. I finally came across a clearing, wide enough for a tent, with just enough flat ground and a faint outline of animal trails through the grass. It seemed like as good a place as any to stop for the night. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and began setting up camp. The air was cool and wet, and the fog moved slowly around me like smoke, drifting between the trunks of the giant trees that surrounded the clearing. I didn't bother making a big meal. I just grabbed a power bar, sat near the tent, and tried to enjoy what little I could see of the forest. It was strange how silent it all was. Usually, the woods have a rhythm, birds, wind, maybe the distant knock of a woodpecker, but there was nothing. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. The kind of silence that makes you overly aware of your own breathing. As darkness came, the fog didn't fade. It just turned black. I'd never experienced anything like it. Even with my flashlight, I could barely see beyond the beam. The edges of the forest disappeared into that pitch darkness, and I started to feel a slow unease building in my chest. I wasn't exactly scared, but I felt exposed. I was in this open spot, surrounded by tall trees, in a fog so thick it swallowed sound and light. I crawled into my tent early and zipped the door tight. The inside felt a little safer, but even then, the sounds of my own breathing seemed too loud. I turned on my small lantern for a bit, wrote a quick note in my journal, and then switched it off, trying to get some sleep. At some point in the night, maybe around 2 in the morning, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, a slow, heavy huffing sound just outside the tent. It was the kind of sound that instantly tightens every muscle in your body. It wasn't a snort or a sniff, but a deep exhale, like someone struggling to breathe through a large nose. It sounded wet, close, and deliberate. I froze, barely breathing. The noise came again, steady, rhythmic, almost labored. It didn't sound like a person, but it didn't sound like a small animal either. It was low and deep, heavy in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was too real, too close. I slowly reached over and grabbed my flashlight, being as quiet as I could. The tent fabric shifted slightly when I moved, and I immediately heard the huff again, this time sharper, like whatever it was had reacted to my movement. I held my breath, The sound came from maybe 5 feet to my right, not even a full arm's length away if you counted the tent wall. For a few seconds, I just sat there, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I thought about everything it could be. A bear, maybe, or a big elk, maybe even something worse. My mind went in 100 directions, and in the middle of all that fog and darkness, every idea seemed possible. Finally, I decided to take a look. I didn't want to sit there all night, frozen, waiting for something to happen. I pulled the drawstring on the tent door slowly, opening just a small slit, and poked my head toward it. The fog was still thick, darker now with no moonlight breaking through. I couldn't see anything. The huffing came again, right outside, followed by the faint sound of something shifting its weight on the wet ground. I took a deep breath, stuck my arm out through the small opening, and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the fog, and there it was. A massive Roosevelt elk stood just a few feet from my tent, its head turned slightly toward the light. For a split second, both of us froze. The elk was enormous, its antlers wide and dark, its breath visible in thick bursts of vapor. It must have been lost or confused in the fog, just like me. The light startled it. In an instant, it spun to bolt, but the ground was slick, and the fog distorted everything. It crashed straight into a tree with a loud, solid thud. The impact echoed through the clearing. The elk fell hard, and for a second I thought it might be dead. I turned off my light, sat frozen, and just listened. A few minutes passed in total silence. Then I heard a faint groan, followed by the sound of the elk shifting, getting back to its feet. It stumbled once, then another grunt, and the sound of hooves started moving away. Branches cracked, brush rustled, and then it was gone, swallowed by the fog and the trees. I sat there in the dark for a long time, too tense to move. I could still hear my heart beating in my ears, and I realized I was shaking. It took me a while to calm down enough to lie back down, and even then, I didn't sleep much. Every creak, every drop of water sliding down the tent fabric made me flinch. When morning finally came, the fog was still there, but a little lighter. I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully. A few yards away, near the tree, I could see a patch of disturbed ground where the elk had fallen. There were hoof prints all around, deep impressions in the soft mud. The bark on the tree was scuffed and dark where it had hit. I packed up my things quickly, ready to move on. The forest was still quiet, but in daylight it didn't feel quite as heavy or menacing. I followed the river again, my boots squelching in the wet ground, and after a couple of hours, I finally started to see the fog thin out. Looking back on it, that night stuck with me, not because of the elk itself, but because of the way it felt to be completely blind and alone in that fog. How easily the mind fills in what it can't see. That thick silence, that dark air pressing against the tent, and the sound of something breathing just outside. It reminded me how fragile that sense of safety really is out there. It's strange. I've hiked a lot since then, camped in worse weather and in wilder places, but that night in the Hoh rainforest remains the one that comes back to me the most. Every time I see fog rolling in through the trees, I think of that sound, that sudden crash in the dark, and how close I came to shining my light on something I wasn't ready to see. It was midwinter when I decided to take that trip, a snowshoe hike deep into the northern Rockies. I'd been planning it for months, waiting for the right stretch of weather when the snow would be firm enough to travel on but not so soft that every step would sink me waist deep. I wanted quiet, total isolation. No roads, no people, no tracks except my own. That's exactly what I got, and more than I wanted. The trail started from a small forest road that hadn't been plowed since November. I parked near the edge where the trees pressed in tight and white snow covered everything in sight. The air was sharp and dry, the kind that stings when you breathe in. My pack was heavy: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 3 days. I wasn't trying to summit anything, just make a loop through an area that rarely saw anyone outside of hunting season. For the first few miles, it was perfect. The snow was hard-packed under a thin crust, the kind that crackles softly with every step. The sun sat low, filtered through bare aspen branches, and the only sound was the quiet rhythm of my breathing. I followed an old trail for a while, one marked faintly by blazes on the trees, but after the second mile it disappeared beneath untouched snow. I kept moving in the general direction I'd planned, using the compass and GPS just to check myself now and then. By midday, I stopped in a small clearing surrounded by pines. The silence there was absolute, not even wind. I ate a snack, brushed the frost from my gloves, and looked out over the endless white. It's strange how in that kind of quiet, you can almost hear your thoughts echo. Every movement feels amplified, and every still moment feels heavier. I pressed on, climbing slowly toward a ridge that would take me to the next valley. The sun had started to dip already, turning the snow into a pale orange glow. I wanted to make camp before dusk, so I kept moving, focused on the steady rhythm of my steps and the sound of the snow crunching beneath me. Then, as I came over a small rise, I saw something that didn't make sense. At first, it looked like shadows on the snow, faint, curved lines, but as I got closer, the shapes sharpened into letters. Words. Someone had written something in the snow, carefully drawn with a finger or maybe a stick. The letters were big, maybe 2 feet high, darkened by the pressure against the icy surface. I stopped, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The words read, "Per audacia ad ignotum," Latin. I didn't know Latin, but I recognized enough of it to know it wasn't random. It looked deliberate, almost neat, the letters perfectly spaced and formed. What made my stomach tighten wasn't the phrase itself, but everything around it. There were no footprints, none at all. I walked in a slow circle around the words, scanning the snow. Nothing disturbed it. No trail, no sign of anyone walking up to or away from the spot. It was like the words had just appeared there. The snow was otherwise perfect, smooth, untouched, the same delicate crust all around. I crouched down to look closer. The edges of the letters were crisp, like they'd been made that morning. The top layer of frost hadn't yet melted or filled them in. I felt an odd chill crawl up my back. I checked my GPS. I was miles from the nearest trailhead, well off any main route. The last human footprints I'd seen were my own, hours behind me. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe wind had erased the tracks, maybe snow had fallen after someone wrote it. But the snow surface was undisturbed for as far as I could see, and there hadn't been any recent flurries. The air was still cold, quiet. I stood there for a while, just staring at those words in the fading light. The phrase looked ancient, deliberate, like it was meant to be found. Per audacia ad ignotum. I didn't know what it meant exactly, but it felt heavy, purposeful. Something about it made me uneasy, not in a dramatic way, but in that slow, sinking way when you realize you're completely alone and something doesn't fit the pattern of the world you know. Eventually, I took a few steps back and snapped a photo with my phone. The battery was already running low from the cold, but I wanted to have proof that I wasn't imagining it. Then I forced myself to keep walking. The ridge wasn't far, and I didn't want to lose daylight standing there over words in the snow that I couldn't explain. As I climbed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The phrase repeated itself in my head with every step. Through audacity toward the unknown. That was the rough meaning I came up with later once I'd looked it up. At the time, I just knew it sounded like something out of a motto or an inscription. But in that moment, alone in the snow, it felt almost like a warning. The temperature dropped fast as the sun went down. By the time I reached the ridge, the shadows had stretched long and blue. I set up my tent in a small sheltered spot between boulders, melted snow for water, and cooked a small meal. The night came on clear and bitter cold. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint creak of the trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting somewhere far below. Even then, lying there, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Those perfect letters in untouched snow, sitting there in silence with no sign of who had written them. I told myself it didn't matter, that there was probably some logical explanation, but logic felt thin in a place that empty. I woke up early the next morning. The air was so cold it burned my lungs when I took a deep breath outside the tent. The light was dim, the kind of flat gray that comes before sunrise. I packed up and started heading back down toward the valley, following roughly the same route I'd come in on. When I reached the rise where the words had been, I slowed down. I wanted to check if they were still there, half curious, half nervous. As I got closer, I could see the area ahead clearly. The flat stretch of snow, open and smooth. The words were gone. The surface looked new, like it had been lightly dusted overnight, maybe just enough wind to cover them. There was no sign they'd ever been there. No indentations, no outline, nothing. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the ground, feeling that strange unease again, the same hollow quiet pressing in on me from all sides. The rest of the hike back was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. When I finally reached the truck and started the engine, I looked down at my phone. The photo was still there, the phrase clearly visible, carved into that perfect field of white. Later, when I got home and thawed out, I translated it properly, per audacia ad ignotum, through audacity toward the unknown. The meaning stuck with me in a way I couldn't explain. It fit the place, that feeling of stepping into something untouched, unexplored, and a little beyond what feels safe. But what bothered me most wasn't the words themselves. It was how they were there, written in snow that no one had walked across, sitting in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone to find them. I still go hiking in the winter sometimes, though not in that area anymore. Every time I see a perfect stretch of snow, I think of that phrase, how clean and deliberate it looked, how wrong it felt to see something so human where there shouldn't have been any sign of people at all. The photo's still on my phone. I've looked at it hundreds of times, trying to spot some detail that explains it. A faint print, a shadow, anything. But there's nothing. Just those words, clear and cold against the white, reminding me of that stillness and that strange sense that maybe some things aren't meant to be understood, only found and left behind. I've been waiting for that hike for weeks. It was late summer, one of those warm, golden evenings in the Santa Monica Mountains when the light filters through the dry brush and everything smells like dust, sage, and hot earth. I was doing a simple 5-mile loop, something I'd done a few times before, starting just before dusk so I could finish as the sun went down. It wasn't exactly remote, not deep wilderness, but it had that quiet, isolated feel once you got a mile or two in. You could see the city off in the distance, a faint shimmer through the haze, but the hills themselves were silent except for the crunch of gravel and the rustle of dry leaves. The trail wound through rolling ridges, up and down through switchbacks lined with chaparral and old oak trees. The air was still warm, the kind of warmth that clings even after the sun dips behind the hills. I had a small pack with water, a headlamp just in case it got dark, and my phone in airplane mode. I wasn't really worried. I'd done solo hikes plenty of times before. I liked the feeling of being alone in that kind of emptiness, just me and the trail. As I got deeper into the loop, the light started to fade faster than I expected. The sun dropped lower, turning everything into silhouettes and long shadows. The hills turned from gold to dark brown, then to gray. The insects started to buzz louder. I remember thinking how the air felt heavier, thicker. The trail was narrow there, a single track cutting along a steep slope. On one side, the land fell away into a canyon filled with brush. On the other, a wall of dry grass and small shrubs closed in tight. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shape, another hiker coming from the opposite direction. I could see the faint outline of a person moving steadily down the path toward me. It wasn't unusual to see someone out there, even that late, but it caught my attention because he was alone, too, and there was something oddly quiet about the way he moved. No trekking poles, no music, no heavy steps. Just this steady, slow approach. We kept walking toward each other, and I remember thinking I'd just nod when we passed, the usual trail courtesy. The light was low enough that I couldn't see his face clearly yet, just the shape of him. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving in that slow, even stride. I got closer, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, and then his face came into focus. Took a second for my brain to catch up. I knew that face, not personally, but unmistakably. It was the man who played James Gum Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. That eerie realization hit me all at once, like a cold rush down my spine. For a moment, I couldn't even remember his real name. I just saw the image burned into my head from that movie. The look, the tone, the unsettling stillness. And now here he was, in real life, on a narrow mountain trail at dusk with nobody else around. He must have seen the recognition hit me, because as we got within just a few feet of each other, his eyes met mine, and I could read everything in his face. There was this tired, almost defeated expression there, like he'd seen that exact reaction 1,000 times. It wasn't anger or pride. It was just a kind of quiet resignation. The look said it all. Yes, I'm him. No, I'm not really a serial killer. We passed each other close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. He had a small pack, plain clothes, and that same distant stare that felt both normal and not at all normal at the same time. I nodded slightly, trying to act casual, but my pulse had already spiked. Every part of me was tense, aware of how alone we were, how quiet it was, how no one else was anywhere near that stretch of trail. I didn't say a word. I just kept walking, a little faster now. My boots scraped the dirt louder than before, my breathing heavier. I didn't look back. Not yet. I didn't want to seem like I was nervous, even though my brain was firing in all directions. I kept thinking about that look on his face, how calm it was, how almost sad. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It lingered in my head in a way that made me uneasy. After maybe 100 yards, I couldn't help myself. I turned around. The trail curved slightly behind me, and through the dusky light I could just barely see his outline, still walking, moving slow, steady, disappearing into the dimness. The fog that sometimes rolled in from the coast was beginning to creep through the low points of the canyon, and it swallowed him up in seconds. One moment he was visible, the next he was gone. I kept walking faster. The trail ahead wound uphill, and I pushed myself hard, partly to get out of there before dark and partly to burn off that nervous energy building in my chest. My heart was thudding in my ears. The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt, that I'd run into that exact person in that exact place at that exact time of day. Out of all the people in Los Angeles, out of all the trails, it was him. As I climbed, the air got cooler. The colors around me faded to a kind of dim bluish gray. The shadows were thick, and every bend in the trail looked like it could hide someone standing there. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck. The silence didn't help. There were no birds now, no rustling in the brush, nothing but the crunch of my own footsteps. At one point, I stopped to take a drink of water, and that's when I realized how completely alone I was. No city noise, no voices, not even the faint hum of a plane, just stillness. I glanced behind me again, half expecting to see someone there, but the trail was empty, curved and vanished into the fading light. I kept moving until I reached the ridge where you can see the ocean from a distance. The horizon was almost dark now, a faint strip of orange fading into black. I turned on my headlamp, the small beam cutting through the dusk. Every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks, but that didn't make me feel much better. As I descended the last mile toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not in an obvious way, just that prickling awareness you get when your instincts are working overtime. The narrow sections of trail made it worse. Cliffs on one side, dense brush on the other. Every few minutes I'd glance behind me, scanning the darkness for movement. I never saw anything, but my mind filled in the gaps anyway. By the time I reached the parking area, the light was almost gone. A few cars were left, mine among them, but no other hikers. I unlocked the door, got in, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. My heart was still beating faster than it should have been for a simple 5-mile loop. As I drove down the winding road back toward the city, the headlights cutting through the dark, I kept replaying that encounter in my head, that instant when I recognized him and that look he gave me. It wasn't menacing, it wasn't aggressive, but it lingered, unsettling in a quiet way. It was like seeing a ghost from something you'd only ever experienced on a screen suddenly made real, alive, breathing the same dry mountain air as you. Later that night, when I was home, showered, and finally sitting still, I looked him up. His real name came to me then, Ted Levine. He'd done other movies, other shows, lived a normal life. But for those few seconds on that trail, all I saw was the character. And maybe that's what unsettled me the most. How easily a face can drag up something buried deep in your memory, something that doesn't belong in the real world but suddenly is. Thinking back on it now, it wasn't fear of him exactly. It was fear of the moment, that strange overlap between fiction and reality, when the world tilts just slightly off balance. The Santa Monica Mountains went quiet, the light faded, and I found myself walking past a man who embodied one of the most disturbing characters ever put on screen. For a brief second, it felt like I'd stepped into that story. When I finally saw the city lights again, I felt an odd relief, that warm, noisy, crowded sense of returning to the world of people. But even now, years later, every time I hike that loop, I think of that moment at dusk, that quiet meeting on a lonely trail where I crossed paths with a face I never expected to see, and the silence that followed me the whole way back down. I was hiking in a national forest with my wife and our dog, a medium-sized shepherd mix who loved being outdoors more than anything. It was a warm day, the kind where the air feels thick but still clean, full of that smell of pine needles, wet dirt, and sun-warmed wood. We had started early, around mid-morning, with the plan to take one of the longer loops that passed by a waterfall and swimming hole before continuing deeper into the forest. The first few miles were easy and beautiful. The trail wound through tall, old trees that filtered the light into soft golden patches. We could hear birds the whole time, and every now and then the distant sound of laughter or water splashing. The waterfall trail was popular, and we passed a few families and groups of friends carrying towels, coolers, and floaties. It felt safe, calm, and alive. My dog was in heaven, tail wagging constantly, nose pressed to the ground. She loved the smell of every stick and rock. She would sometimes run ahead a few yards and then look back, making sure we were still there before trotting forward again. When we reached the waterfall, there were maybe 20 people scattered around the pool. Some were swimming, some sitting on the rocks eating snacks. We stopped to rest for a while, sitting near the edge where the mist from the falls cooled the air. My wife refilled our water bottles, and the dog drank from the stream. It felt like one of those perfect days. Quiet, away from everything, nothing but woods and water. After about 20 minutes, we decided to keep going. The main trail continued upward along the side of the waterfall. It was steeper from there, narrow in parts and rougher underfoot. As soon as we started climbing, the sound of people faded behind us until all we could hear again was the steady rush of the falls and our own footsteps. Within a few minutes, the voices and laughter were completely gone. The climb wasn't too bad, but it was steep enough that most people turned around at the waterfall. That was what we liked about it. Once you got past the main attraction, you usually had the forest to yourself. We hiked another mile or two beyond it, following the trail as it wound along a ridge that offered glimpses of the valley through breaks in the trees. The air was still and warm. Every now and then a light breeze would move through, carrying the smell of damp moss and leaves. Our dog stayed in front as usual, walking confidently with her leash slack between us. She was still happy, tail swinging, occasionally stopping to sniff at the side of the trail. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But after a while, the trail started to close in. The trees grew closer together, the underbrush thicker, and the light dimmed a little even though it was only midday. That was when it happened. In one of the densest parts of the trail, my dog froze. It was sudden. 1 second she was walking. The next she stopped so abruptly that the leash jerked tight in my hand. Her tail went stiff, her body lowered slightly, and she stared dead ahead into the trees. At first, I thought she had seen a squirrel or deer, but she didn't lunge or bark. She just stood there completely still, staring. I looked ahead but couldn't see anything out of place. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The normal background noises, birds, bugs, the distant rustle of small animals, seemed to vanish all at once. I remember that silence clearly. It wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin tighten, like the air itself is holding its breath. I tried to coax her forward, but she wouldn't move. She started to tremble slightly, her ears back, her tail low. Then she began to whine, a sound I had never heard from her before, high, shaky, full of fear. She turned her head and tried to pull back up the trail the way we'd come. It wasn't playful or curious. It was panic, pure instinctive fear. My wife and I stood there for a long moment, listening. I kept scanning the trees, trying to pick up any movement or sound, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing, just the dense wall of trees and the faint creak of branches in the still air. The forest felt heavier all of a sudden, like the light couldn't reach us properly anymore. That feeling, that weight of silence and dread, got under my skin. My dog had been around bears before, even coyotes. She'd barked at them, stood her ground. But this was different. She didn't want to fight or investigate. She wanted to run. I could feel my heart rate rising. I tried to convince myself it was a bear ahead on the trail, or maybe a bobcat crouched somewhere we couldn't see. But the woods were dense and visibility was bad. If it had been an animal, I should have at least heard movement. A branch snapping, a low growl, something. But it was dead silent. The longer we stood there, the more wrong it felt. My dog was now shaking visibly, her leash pulling tight as she kept trying to turn around. I finally gave in to that instinct, her instinct, and we turned back. As soon as we did, she bolted forward, pulling hard on the leash, almost dragging us up the trail. It was like she couldn't get away fast enough. We didn't talk, didn't stop. The only sounds were our footsteps and the fast panting of the dog as we climbed back toward the waterfall. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing there, just trees. When we finally started to hear the waterfall again, that low rumbling sound of water over rock, I felt some of the tension leave my chest. We reached the main area where people were still swimming and lounging by the pool. The moment we were around others, the dog calmed down slightly, though she still stayed close, ears perked and eyes scanning the woods behind us. We sat down for a while near the water again, trying to relax, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That moment when she froze, the silence, the feeling that something had been watching us. I looked back toward the trail entrance where we'd come from and felt this heavy sense that something was still there, just out of sight. After resting a bit, we made our way back to the car. The whole walk out, the dog kept glancing behind us, her body tense. Even when we reached the parking lot, she didn't relax until we were in the car with the doors closed. That drive back was quiet. Neither of us felt like saying anything. It was one of those experiences that leaves you uneasy even after it's over. You keep trying to explain it logically. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a big cat. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like something had been there and had stayed completely still, just watching us. I've gone hiking a lot since then, in other forests, other trails, and I've never seen my dog act that way again. She's still the same happy, fearless animal she's always been. But that day, in that stretch of dense forest, something made her terrified enough to refuse to go forward. I've thought about it many times since. Maybe we were lucky. Maybe we turned around just in time. There are things in the woods you might never see, but that still see you. And sometimes listening to your dog, that simple, primal fear, might be the only reason you make it back. We never went back to that trail again. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of quiet weekend day when everything feels slower than usual. The air was cool but bright, and I decided to take my dog out for a long walk. We usually went to a small park near my house, a place with a few winding trails that ran through patches of woods before looping back into the neighborhood. It wasn't a big park. You could walk across it in less than half an hour, but it was peaceful and close enough that I didn't need to drive anywhere. My dog, a sturdy black lab mix, was always excited when he saw the leash. He loved the trails more than the streets, mostly because of all the new smells. Squirrels, other dogs, damp leaves, dirt. I packed a small bottle of water, hooked on his leash, and we headed out. The park was quiet when we got there. A few cars were parked along the curb near the trailhead, but not many. Usually there were joggers or people walking their dogs, but that day it felt emptier than usual. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people just stayed home when the weather cooled off. The first part of the trail cut through open grass and then dipped into a small patch of trees. It wasn't thick forest, just enough to muffle the sounds from the road and make you feel like you were a little deeper into nature than you actually were. I liked that about it, close to home, but quiet enough that you could clear your head. About 10 minutes in, we came around a bend, and I noticed a man walking toward us. He was coming down the trail in the opposite direction, moving slowly, his hands in his jacket pockets. At first glance, there wasn't anything too strange about him, but something about the way he looked made me notice him more than I normally would have. His clothes didn't really match the weather. He wore a heavy coat even though it wasn't that cold. His face looked tense, eyes darting around instead of focusing ahead. It wasn't the way people usually looked on a casual weekend walk. We passed each other on the trail, and I gave a small nod like I usually do when I pass someone, but he didn't react. His head turned slightly as we went by, like he was trying to look without turning too much. My dog didn't bark or pull. He just glanced up at the man as we walked past and then kept going. I tried to shrug it off. You see all kinds of people on public trails, and it's not unusual for some to be a little odd. We walked on for another 5 minutes or so, heading uphill along the narrow dirt path that cut through a cluster of trees. It was quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air had that still, muffled quality that woods sometimes get when the wind stops moving. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional jingle of my dog's collar. Then I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, a soft scrape, like a shoe sliding on gravel. I slowed down slightly, listening. Another sound came a few seconds later, the quiet but steady rhythm of footsteps. I turned my head, half expecting to see another hiker or maybe someone jogging. But when I looked, my heart jumped a little. The man we'd passed earlier was behind us. He was farther down the trail, maybe 40 or 50 feet back, but close enough that I recognized the heavy coat and the same uneven pace. For a moment I thought maybe he had turned around for some reason, maybe forgot something, but it didn't feel right. He wasn't moving casually. His steps were slower, quieter, like he was trying not to draw attention. My dog noticed him too. His ears perked up and he stopped walking. He looked over his shoulder, then back at me, and I could see the fur on his neck start to lift slightly. He wasn't growling or barking, but he was alert, rigid, watching. I felt that wave of unease crawl into my chest, that instinctive, uncomfortable feeling when something doesn't add up. I told myself not to panic, just keep moving. I started walking again, a little faster this time, keeping the leash tight. The trail ahead curved uphill, and I could see where it branched off toward the neighborhood on the far side of the park. The sound of footsteps behind me continued, steady and measured. Every time I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, they sped up. It wasn't loud, but I could hear the rhythm, and I could feel my pulse start to climb. My dog suddenly stopped again, this time more abruptly. He turned off the trail, pulling hard toward a narrow path that led up through the brush toward the fence line that separated the park from the neighborhood. He never did that. He loved the main trail, and I always had to tug him away from side paths or open areas. But now he was insistent. His body was tense, his leash pulled tight, and he gave another tug, trying to move up through the trees. I hesitated for only a second before following him. I figured maybe he'd heard something, maybe another animal, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I could feel it in that tight, nervous way my stomach twisted. We cut up the incline, pushing through brush and dry leaves, and I glanced back down the trail. The man had stopped where we turned off. He was standing completely still, looking up in our direction. The woods weren't dense enough to hide him, and for a split second our eyes met. Then he turned around and started walking back the way he'd come. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, watching until I couldn't see him anymore. My dog was still pulling to keep moving toward the neighborhood, so I followed his lead. The climb was short, and within a minute or two, we came out onto a side street lined with houses. We walked home quietly. My dog's tail stayed low the entire way, his head turning back every few steps as if checking behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong back there. When we got home, he went straight to his water bowl and lay down by the door, still alert but calmer now. I stood by the window, looking out toward the trees in the distance, thinking about that man. There was no real proof he was dangerous. He hadn't said or done anything, but there was something in the way he appeared behind us after walking the opposite direction, the way he matched our pace, the way my dog reacted before I even processed what was happening. I went back to that park a few times after that, but only during busier hours when more people were around. I never saw the man again, Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he just turned around and happened to be walking the same route. But my dog's reaction that day told me otherwise. He's not the type to scare easily, and he never leaves the trail, never. That day changed how I look at little things like that. You learn that animals, especially dogs, sense things we don't. They pick up on body language, energy, tension, things too subtle for us to notice right away. My dog didn't need to understand what was wrong. He just knew something was. Now, whenever I hike or walk with him, I pay close attention to how he acts. If he stops, I stop. If he turns around, I turn around. Because that day in that small park, I realized something simple but serious. Sometimes the difference between feeling safe and being safe is just whether or not you listen. We never took that particular trail again. Every time I passed by the entrance, I remember how quiet it was, how still the air felt, and how quickly things can shift from peaceful to wrong. I trust my dog more than I trust my instincts now. He got us out of something that might have turned into something far worse. And every time I clip his leash on before a walk, I remember that moment, the pull on the leash, the look over his shoulder, and those words stick in my head. Always listen to your dog. It was late afternoon when I decided to take my dog out for a hike. The day was cool and overcast, the kind of gray light that makes everything look slightly muted. My dog, a stocky, muscular bully breed with more energy than sense, was practically bouncing at the end of her leash as we got out of the car. She loved the woods, loved the dirt under her paws and the wide open smells of pine, mud, and other animals. The trail we were taking wasn't too remote. It was part of a state park not far from the city. A few miles long, looping through the trees and back to the main parking area. I'd been there plenty of times before, never had an issue. When we started walking, there were still quite a few people around. Couples, families, joggers. My dog trotted along happily, tail wagging, occasionally glancing up at people as we passed. She's strong and protective, but she's always been friendly with strangers on the trail. She usually ignores them completely once she realizes they're not interested in her. About 20 minutes in, we came around a bend where the trail narrowed between two steep embankments. That's when I saw him, a man maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, walking toward us from the opposite direction. He was tall, thin, wearing a long jacket that looked too heavy for the weather. His steps were slow, uneven, and there was something about his expression, not angry, not sad, just blank, that made me look twice. He didn't look like someone out for a casual walk. His eyes were small, darting from side to side like he was paying attention to every sound. As we got closer, my dog's body changed instantly. 1 second, she was walking loosely beside me, tail wagging, breathing steady. The next, she went stiff, her head lowered, ears forward. She started growling, a low rumble that came from deep in her chest. I tightened the leash and tried to keep moving, thinking maybe she smelled another dog. But when we got about 10 feet away from the man, she lunged forward, snapping and barking with a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not just warning, but furious, protective, like she was ready to tear something apart. I pulled back on her harness with both hands, digging my heels into the dirt. She was strong, muscle straining, still trying to get at him. The man didn't move much. He just stopped walking and stared, completely calm, almost too calm. His eyes stayed on me while my dog barked and fought against the leash like she was trying to attack. After what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds, I managed to pull her back far enough to create space. I turned and started walking away fast, muttering an apology over my shoulder even though he didn't say anything. My dog kept glancing back over her shoulder, growling under her breath for another minute or two before settling down. Once we were around the next bend and out of sight, I tried to breathe normally again. My heart was pounding. I couldn't understand what had set her off like that. She'd been fine all day, perfectly friendly with everyone we'd passed. I figured maybe he'd looked at her wrong or smelled strange. Dogs pick up on all sorts of things. Either way, I didn't want to think about it too much. I just kept walking, trying to enjoy the trail again. We went on for another 10 or 15 minutes. The woods were quiet, the light starting to dim a little more as the clouds thickened overhead. Every now and then we'd pass another hiker and she was completely fine again. Tail up, relaxed, even wagging at a woman who stopped to smile at her. Felt normal again, calm. I started to convince myself that whatever had happened earlier was just a fluke. Then it changed again, fast. We were walking through a stretch of trail where the trees pressed close on both sides, the kind of place where you can't see very far ahead or behind. My dog was trotting slightly ahead when she suddenly froze. Her body stiffened, muscles locked, and her ears went straight up. I barely had time to register it before she spun around, facing the direction we'd just come from. She started growling again, deeper this time, her whole body trembling with tension. Then she lunged backward, barking violently at something behind me. I turned around fast, and that's when I saw him again. The same man. He was less than 5 feet away. He was just standing there in the middle of the trail, silent, staring straight at me. I had no idea how he'd gotten there so quietly or why he'd followed us. My stomach dropped. I felt that sharp surge of panic, the kind that hits before you can even think. My dog was lunging so hard that I had to plant my feet to keep from being pulled off balance. Her teeth were bared, foam at the corners of her mouth, eyes locked on him. The man didn't say a word, didn't even flinch. He just stood there watching. Then, in that same slow, deliberate way, he took one step forward. That was enough. I turned and started walking quickly down the trail, half dragging my dog with me. She kept looking back, barking every few seconds. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it was echoing in my head. I could hear his footsteps behind us, faint but steady. He wasn't running, but he was following. The trail curved again, and just ahead I could see movement. A small group of people coming our way. 2 women and a man, carrying water bottles and day packs, chatting as they walked toward the parking lot. The sound of their voices was the most relieving thing I'd heard all day. I moved toward them without thinking, keeping my dog close. As soon as we got near them, I turned slightly to glance back. The man had stopped. He was standing in the middle of the trail again, not far from where I'd first seen him. He looked at the group, then at me, and then turned off the trail, walking slowly back into the woods. I didn't move for a moment. My dog stayed close, still growling softly but starting to calm down. The group passed by, talking quietly among themselves, unaware of what had just happened. I stood there until I couldn't see him anymore through the trees. We walked the rest of the way back to the car in silence. My dog stayed alert the entire time, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. When we finally reached the parking lot, there were still a few cars left, but the air had that feeling of quiet that comes before evening. I got her in the car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, catching my breath. Driving home, I kept replaying it in my head, her reaction, his eyes, the way he'd appeared behind me without a sound. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself maybe he'd just taken a different trail and happened to end up behind us, but it didn't make sense. The park wasn't big enough for that to happen by accident. He had to have followed us, keeping close enough to stay out of sight until the trail curved again. I couldn't stop thinking about how my dog had known before I did. She sensed something wrong about him from the start, something I couldn't see or explain. She'd gone from calm to defensive in an instant, and the moment she turned around that second time, I knew she'd been right. Since then, I've never ignored her instincts. If she tenses up, if she growls at someone, I listen. I don't try to reason it away or assume it's nothing. Animals don't overthink danger, they just feel it. And that day, her instincts probably saved me from something I don't even want to imagine. I've gone back to that park only a few times since, but I stay on the more open trails now. I stick close to the parking area, and I always keep an eye behind me. The woods still look the same, still quiet and calm, but I can't walk them without remembering the sound of her growl or the way that man just stood there, watching. That day taught me something simple but important. When your dog tells you something's wrong, you believe them, because sometimes they see the danger long before you ever do. I was hiking alone that morning, just outside a small mountain town in northern Georgia. It was early spring, the air still had a chill, and the trees were just beginning to show color again. I had planned the route the night before, a moderate 8-mile loop that followed an old logging trail up through the ridge and back down near a creek. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, so I wasn't worried. I packed light, a small day pack, a knife, water, and some snacks. The morning started calm. The forest was quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. The ground was damp from rain the day before, so every step made that soft, sticky sound of mud pulling at my boots. I liked that feeling, being alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the smell of wet earth. A few miles in, the trail narrowed. It wound uphill through dense undergrowth, where visibility dropped to maybe 20 yards in any direction. The trees grew close together, and the slope made every step a little harder. I stopped once to drink water and noticed that the forest had gone oddly quiet. No birds, no movement. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like everything was listening. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, like something heavy moving through the brush behind me. A low rustling, followed by the sound of twigs snapping under weight. I stopped, listening. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a deer either. Deer move fast and light. This was slow, deliberate. I turned around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just layers of green and brown and shadow. I told myself it was probably some big animal, maybe a stray dog or a bear, though bears were rare around there. I kept walking. A few minutes later, the sound came again, closer this time. I froze. My pulse started to pick up. I turned slowly, gripping my hiking stick. This time I saw movement, just a quick flash. Something low, dark, and muscular slipping between the trees. At first, I thought it was a wild boar, but then it stepped out into the open, and I saw it clearly. It was a dog. Big, thick chest, short coat, heavy head. A pit bull or something close, maybe a mix. It looked like it had been living wild for a while. Its fur was matted, ribs showing slightly, but it still looked strong. Too strong. It stood there staring at me, still and silent. Its tail was low, not wagging, and its ears were perked forward. The way it looked at me made my skin crawl. I had owned dogs my whole life, and I could tell immediately this wasn't curiosity. It was focus. I slowly started backing away, keeping my eyes on it. I didn't run, didn't make noise, just moved steady. The dog stayed where it was for a few seconds, then took one slow step forward, then another. I kept moving back until I couldn't see it anymore around a bend. That's when I heard the low growl. It wasn't loud, but it went straight through me. I started walking faster. Every few seconds, I'd look back. I didn't see it, but I could hear it following, soft, quick footsteps moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. After a few minutes, I came to a fork in the trail. The main path curved uphill, and a smaller side trail cut down toward the creek. I decided to take the side trail. It was narrower and overgrown, but it might lead me back toward the main road faster. The trail sloped sharply downward, slick with mud. I could still hear the dog behind me, but it was getting closer. I started half jogging, careful not to slip. The branches scratched my arms as I pushed through. Then I heard it again, the growl, much closer now. I turned my head and saw it maybe 30 feet away, moving fast through the brush. It wasn't barking, just coming straight for me, silent except for the sound of its paws hitting the ground. I ran. I'm not a fast runner, especially on uneven ground, but adrenaline does strange things. I could hear it behind me, panting hard, branches snapping. I didn't look back. I knew it was gaining. The trail curved sharply, and I tried to cut the corner, slipping in the mud and crashing down onto my side. My pack hit the ground, and for a second I couldn't breathe. When I looked up, it was there, 10 feet away, teeth bared, mud spattering its chest. Its eyes were locked on me. I grabbed the stick I'd dropped and scrambled to my feet. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me. The dog lunged once, stopped, then lunged again. I swung the stick as hard as I could, connected with its shoulder, but it barely slowed. It went low, hitting my leg with its weight, and I fell back again. I felt its teeth graze my boot. Not a full bite, but enough to tear through the leather. I kicked out hard, connecting with its face, and scrambled backward up the slope, grabbing at roots and rocks. It followed, snarling, slipping in the mud as it tried to get traction. I swung again, this time hitting it square on the nose. It yelped and pulled back, shaking its head, then disappeared into the brush. I didn't wait. I ran downhill, branches whipping across my face. My chest felt like it was going to burst. I could still hear it moving behind me, but farther away now. After what felt like forever, I saw water through the trees, the creek. The bank was steep, and I slid down the last few feet, nearly falling into the water. The cold hit me like ice when I stepped in, but I didn't care. I crossed to the other side, moving as fast as I could, slipping on the rocks. Once I was across, I turned around. The dog had stopped at the edge of the creek. It stood there watching me. Its chest was heaving, mud dripping from its fur. It didn't follow into the water. It just stared for a long time, then turned and vanished into the woods. I stayed there for a while, trying to catch my breath, shaking from exhaustion. I checked my leg, torn pants, shallow cuts, but no deep bite. My stick was cracked from the hits, my hands raw. The rest of the hike back to the road felt endless. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I kept expecting to see it again, but I didn't. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, the relief nearly made me weak. I sat inside for a long time before starting the engine. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. The forest was still behind me, quiet and calm again, like nothing had happened. That night, when I cleaned the cuts and mud off my leg, I saw deep tooth marks on the side of my boot. The leather was punctured clean through. If it had latched on just a few inches higher, it would have been my calf instead. I still hike, but I carry a heavier stick now, and I pay more attention to sounds behind me. People always talk about mountain lions, bears, or snakes being the dangers out there. But it's the ones you don't think about, the ones that move silent and fast, the ones that used to trust people, that scare me the most. That dog wasn't evil or cursed or anything out of a story. It was just hungry, maybe abandoned, maybe feral. But when I looked into its eyes, I saw something I can't forget. Not madness, not fear, but instinct, pure and cold. And when I think back on that day, I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't swung that stick at exactly the right moment, I wouldn't have walked out of those woods at all. There's a saying that always stuck with me. Boldly go where no one has gone before. I used to laugh at it, thinking it was just something from an old show, a line people threw around when they wanted to sound adventurous. But that sentence came to mean something entirely different the day I decided to take a solo hike through a section of wilderness that, as far as I could tell, barely saw any human footsteps. It was supposed to be an adventure. It ended up being something else entirely. It started in the early spring a few years back. The snow was melting fast in the higher elevations, and the runoff had filled every creek and ravine with rushing water. I'd been hiking for years, doing harder trails each season, and I wanted to push myself further, away from the usual routes, away from the beaten paths. I found a stretch of forest out in the Cascades that didn't have an official trail but looked like it could be crossed with some careful navigation. I studied the topo maps for weeks, planned the route, and marked out 2 possible camp spots based on the terrain. The plan was simple: hike in, spend a night, and return by a different route, completing a rough loop. The morning I started, the air was cool and heavy with mist. The first few miles were through dense firs and cedar, the kind of forest where light filters down in thin beams and everything smells like wet bark. I moved slowly at first, adjusting to the weight of the pack, checking my bearings every so often. The only sounds were the distant rush of water and the steady rhythm of my boots sinking into the damp earth. After a few hours, I reached a point where even the faint signs of human passage, old cut branches, the ghost of a trail, disappeared completely. It was just forest now, thick and quiet. I felt that odd mix of calm and alertness that comes with being alone in the wild. Every small noise, a squirrel scurrying, a branch creaking overhead, registered sharply. By midday, I was deep into the area I'd mapped. The terrain began to rise, the trees thinning out a little to reveal a steep hillside covered in moss and rocks. The climb was slow, hands and knees at some points, the pack throwing my balance off. The air got colder the higher I went, and the mist turned to a low fog that drifted between the trees. I stopped to rest on a small outcrop, drinking water and watching the fog move through the valley below. There was no sound except for wind and my own breathing. It was exactly the solitude I'd come for, but sitting there, I realized how isolated I actually was. My GPS showed no nearby trails, no cell service, no markers. Just me and miles of untouched forest. After resting, I kept climbing. The slope leveled out into a small plateau that opened into a clearing, ringed by tall trees leaning slightly from years of storms. The ground was soft with moss and patches of snow still clinging in the shade. It looked like a good place to make camp for the night. I dropped my pack, stretched, and walked around the clearing to get a feel for the area. That's when I saw something strange. On the far side of the clearing, near a cluster of rocks, something had been scratched into the surface of one of them. At first I thought it was just grooves from falling branches or animal claw marks, but as I got closer, I saw they formed letters. Crude, shallow, but unmistakably deliberate. The words read, "Boldly go where no one has gone before." The words were weathered, like they'd been there a long time. The edges were worn down, smoothed by rain and time, but still readable. The size of the letters made it clear someone had taken their time to carve them. Not just a few minutes, but long enough to make them deep and straight. It made no sense. This wasn't a place people wandered into by accident. There was no sign of a campsite, no fire ring, no litter, nothing to suggest anyone had been there for years. I looked around carefully. The ground was undisturbed except for animal tracks. No boot prints, no gear, no tools. Just those words, etched into the stone in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at them. The phrase that had always felt adventurous, even funny, suddenly felt heavy, almost mocking. It didn't feel like a message of courage. It felt like a warning. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably from some backpacker years ago who'd passed through and wanted to leave something behind. Maybe they were making a joke, maybe just marking the spot. I walked back to my gear, set up camp, and tried not to think about it. The evening came slowly. The fog thickened again, rolling low across the ground. I cooked a small meal, watching the light fade into a dull gray. The silence deepened with the dark, that kind of silence you only get in deep wilderness, where even the insects go quiet. As night settled in, the forest around me changed. The wind picked up, rattling the branches above. I could hear faint cracks in the distance. Falling branches, maybe, or the echo of rocks shifting on the slope. I zipped up my tent and lay inside, the thin fabric between me and miles of black forest. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just that I felt instantly alert, my heart already beating faster. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that seeps through the sleeping bag. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A faint scraping noise. It was steady, slow, like something dragging lightly over rock. It came from somewhere close, maybe the direction of that carved stone. It would scrape for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. I lay completely still, listening. The sound wasn't loud, but in that silence, it carried clearly. Continued for several minutes, scrape, pause, scrape, then nothing. The forest went quiet again, too quiet. I stayed awake for hours after that, straining to hear anything else. My mind started spinning with explanations. An animal maybe, digging for something, or the wind moving debris. But the rhythm of that sound had felt deliberate, steady, not random. By morning, I hadn't slept much. The fog still hung low, thick and pale. I got out of the tent, every movement slow and cautious. The clearing looked unchanged. The air was still. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving, but before I left, I walked back to the stone. The words were still there, but something about them looked different. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe the light, maybe my imagination, but when I crouched down, I saw it clearly. The surface of the rock had new scratches, faint, shallow lines, scattered around the carved phrase like someone had started to chip away at it and then stopped. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling that cold tightening in my chest again. There were no footprints. The snow patches nearby were untouched. The moss around the rock looked undisturbed, but the scratches were fresh, sharp-edged, lighter than the rest of the stone. I didn't wait around to think it through. I tightened the straps on my pack and started down the mountain, following my compass south toward the nearest drainage that would lead me back toward the car. I moved fast, barely stopping for water. The forest felt different on the way down. Every sound made me tense. The snap of twigs, the whisper of wind through the branches. The fog followed me, never lifting, wrapping the trees in a dull haze that made everything look the same. I checked my map constantly, double-checking the direction, afraid of losing the route. It took most of the day to make it back to the main forest road. When I finally saw the outline of the truck through the trees, the relief hit hard, that deep kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been on edge for hours without even knowing it. When I got home that night, I pulled out the photo I'd taken of the rock. I'd snapped one right before leaving camp, without even thinking about it. The picture was clear, the words easy to read. But what caught my eye wasn't the phrase. It was something beside it, faint lines in the moss just beyond the frame. At first I thought they were scratches or roots. Then I looked closer. They were letters, small, faint, unfinished, like someone had started carving again. That was the last time I ever went off-trail alone. I've done plenty of hikes since, but always on marked routes, places where I know others have walked. That phrase doesn't sound brave anymore. Every time I hear it, boldly go where no one has gone before, I think of that silent clearing, that cold fog, and the faint sound of something scraping against stone in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if whoever wrote those words had meant them as a challenge or a warning for whoever came after. Either way, I took the message. Some places don't need more footsteps. Some places are better left unknown.